Welcome back to another Kerbal Space Program video, guys, and in today's Kerbal Space Program video, we're going to be building an SSTO, but this one's going to have a twist, because this SSTO has infinite range, and I don't mean that through means of like mining or whatever. I mean it literally has infinite range, because this SSTO is powered by a Kraken Drive. For those unfamiliar, a Kraken Drive is a means of propelling a craft using some sort of physics exploit in Kerbal Space Program. So it's a bit like cheating, basically, but you're not technically using cheat codes or anything. The Alt F12 menu is nowhere to be seen, so it's technically not quite cheating. It's just sort of exploiting some sort of physics quirk in Kerbal Space Program. Now, the first half of this Kraken Drive, you can see there, it's that inflatable docking port. I'm not going to construct the second half of the Kraken Drive just yet. We're going to quickly finish the rest of the aircraft first, and then we'll go back to how this Kraken Drive is going to work, and obviously finish the construction of it. So the aircraft itself is nothing special, really. I wanted something that could glide fairly easily to make landing on atmospheric bodies, including returning to the Kerbal Space Center, fairly easy. I also added some practical functionality to it by adding every single science experiment available in the game into that anterior cargo bay as well. And blink and you miss it whilst I'm setting up the action groups, but I bound the inflation and deflation of that inflatable airlock to the spacebar. That's going to be the toggle that activates and deactivates the Kraken Drive in this aircraft. And speaking of which, let's get to quickly discussing how this Kraken Drive is going to work. Docking ports in Kerbal Space Program have magnets inside them just to make docking and stuff easier, because the docking ports will pull the two ships together. However, what's interesting is that the docking ports will still attract each other even when they're both on the same craft. I've built this little test rig to show you what happens, but I have two docking ports on here facing each other, and if we just activate the magnets of that rear one, you can see it starts being attracted to that front docking port and pulls the whole vessel forwards. So this is a good start for our Kraken Drive, but I kind of wanted it to be controllable. So my first instinct was, what if we attach that rear docking port to a piston and then bind the piston's extension to the main throttle, so we have some throttle control over the Kraken Drive. Unfortunately, it didn't really work too well. While the Kraken Drive works, once those docking ports enter each other's magnetic range, the piston just sort of snaps in place and then it won't respond to any further commands. So it's basically no different to just having the two static docking port setup we had on that prototype craft. And so dashed were my dreams of having a throttleable Kraken Drive on this thing, but I was able to come up with a solution that would at least let us toggle it on and off fairly easily. The inflatable docking port in this game can expand and retract much like the pistons can, but when that inflatable docking port enters the magnetic range of the front docking ports, it can still then retract and effectively deactivate the Kraken Drive. Now, we do still have some control over the throttle of the Kraken Drive, because we can just right-click the docking acquire force gauge of that inflatable docking port and manually adjust it when needed, but it wasn't really ideal. I wanted this thing to be fully controllable using only the keyboard, much like how you would control a normal engine in the game, so I felt this was the best solution to achieve what I wanted to achieve. Now, you may have noticed I clipped lots and lots of docking ports to the front aspect of the Kraken Drive. It seems that with this particular Kraken Drive, having more docking ports on the front aspect of the drive increases your overall power. Now, I can't take full credit for the design of this particular Kraken Drive. This exploit was first discovered about 3 months ago by Reddit user Zompigespons, who was the first person that I know of to build a simple ship that uses this docking port exploit, where you just pull your own ship towards yourself. And I believe the first person to implement this into a Spaceplane design was a YouTuber called Maximillion. Although both of these designs do require right-clicking that posterior docking port to toggle the thrust on and off, I feel like this design here is a good improvement, because it does give you a bit more control just using action groups, which was what my main objective was when it came to designing this particular version of the Kraken Drive. So the next evolutionary step for this thing, if anyone can figure it out, would be to try and overcome that piston problem I had. If we can get this to work using pistons, then we can bind the piston to the main throttle control, which will allow even greater control over the Kraken Drive than this current craft that I'm presenting here. Now, one thing you might be thinking is that this doesn't work unless those cargo bays are open, because we can't toggle that airlock when it's stored. And you're right, so that rear cargo bay is actually open, but I've just set the deploy limiter to be the lowest possible value so that it looks like it's closed. And then we're only actually going to open that front one to access the science experiments. For all intents and purposes, that rear one is just the engine house. It's not supposed to be open. That's why I just put those air brakes on top of it, because I have no intention of ever actually opening the doors. But as you can see, the Spaceplane is pretty much done. I thought before we launched we'd have some fun with some custom flags. Since this is kind of a cheaty aircraft, I thought let's just make it look silly. So I added loads of little decals to make it a bit more visually interesting, given that the airframe is, fairly understated. I don't think I need to show you the placement of all of those flags though, so we can crossfade across to our launch. So there is Jebediah and Bob Kerbin ready to go. Now, I didn't bother waiting for any particular launch window because we have infinite delta V and we've got pretty good thrust to weight ratio as well, so transfer windows don't matter in the slightest. We can force an encounter with any planet or moon very, very easily. So in this mission, I wanted to try and make it a little bit challenging. I have made the outrageous claim that this vehicle is capable of landing on and returning from any planet and moon in the game. So let's go all out. Let's go to Eve's sea level and then back to Kerbin again. So that's going to be what we're doing in this mission. We're going to go to Eve sea level and then go back to Kerbin again. Don't know why I felt the need to say that again. Now, you might have noticed I added some visual flair to this thing, just to make it a bit more believable that there is some sort of engine powering this thing. So I have those green lights at the rear of the craft, just underneath the wings. This not only makes it a bit more fun to fly, because you've got like something that looks like a real engine powering this thing, but it also serves as a good visual indicator of when the Kraken Drive is active. Unfortunately, the lights take a little while to fade in and out when you activate and deactivate them, so sometimes they can go a bit out of sync with the inflatable docking port. So the best way of looking to see if the Kraken Drive is active is to look at the G-force indicator just underneath that SAS light. If the G-force is a non-zero value, and provided we're in the vacuum of space, then that means the drive is on. But there you are. Our ascension into space was pretty effortless. Couldn't really get much easier if we tried. So now I'm just going to time warp up to our apoapsis point before pointing prograde and activating the drive again. And there we are. We can see we've circularized in absolutely no time. So now it's time to plot a course to Eve. Now, as I said earlier, transfer windows are pretty irrelevant for this craft because no matter where the planets are located, we can just force an encounter. And Eve is actually pretty close by making this ridiculous maneuver node here. We can get an encounter with Eve that's going to get us to the planet in under a month, which is pretty unreal. Granted, it's going to be a very, very expensive burn, but of course doesn't really affect us because we have infinite range, because we have a Kraken Drive. So just going to time warp around to the maneuver node. I'm so used to the maneuver node being at prograde that I accidentally dropped out of time warp a bit too soon. Now we've reached that node, we can once again fire up that Kraken Drive, and you can see how quickly that maneuver node is executed. Now, granted, I am playing back this footage at 2.5 times normal speed, but even so, we're going at a pretty good pace. I guess I'm just so used to using the nuclear engines in this game that this is a bit of a breath of fresh air in terms of performance. Now, as that maneuver node runs down, we're going to have a look at the map screen and make sure that we're on our Eve encounter. And whoops, we're not. And this is kind of one of the downsides to this particular Kraken Drive. Ideally, it would be nice to be able to activate it and deactivate it from the map screen, but unfortunately we can't. So we have to sort of tab out of the map screen, quickly fire up the Kraken Drive, and then go back to the map screen and see how it's affecting our orbit. And, this thing has fairly high thrust-to-weight ratio, so it can be a bit of a difficult balance to strike. So I do spend a bit of time in this mission messing around trying to get my Eve encounter to bring us fairly close to Eve, but I think in retrospect what would have been easier would just be to get any old encounter. Doesn't really matter. We can just perform our circularization once we've entered the sphere of influence, because again, I think I'm just used to making things as efficient as possible, when really it's not a mindset you need to really be thinking about with the Kraken Drive craft, because fuel and delta V and all that, these are just meaningless words in the wonderful world of Kraken Drives. So here I've basically got the Kraken Drive activated and I'm just spinning around on the nav ball using auto SAS to try and force those separation nodes to get closer and ultimately result in our Eve encounter. It ain't pretty, it's pretty ham-fisted and very inefficient, but it doesn't really matter because it worked! Now, I did mention earlier that the lights I've got on this thing can sometimes go out of sync with the activation of the inflatable docking port, just because both of those components take some time to spool up, be it the slow illumination of the lights themselves or indeed the inflation process of the airlock. So sometimes I do have to quickly reset the lights to make sure that the action group is still turning the lights on when I inflate the docking port and turning them off when I deflate the docking port, and not the opposite of that, because then it can get a little bit confusing when relying on those lights to serve as an indication for when the drive is active. Hence why I would recommend using the G-force indicator on the nav ball rather than necessarily using those lights. The lights are only there really just for a bit of fun, make this craft look a little bit more sci-fi and interesting, I guess. But there we are. About 3 weeks later, we have now entered another planet sphere of influence. That is the ridiculousness of this craft. So now I can just time warp along to our Eve apoapsis and begin the deceleration process. It's going to be a big old burn, but again, that's irrelevant because we have infinite fuel. And so I could just pass the time and run some of our science experiments to get some data from this mission, although I think I've already got science from space high above Eve on this particular save file, so it's really just an exercise in boredom whilst we wait for our orbital line to swing around into a captured Eve orbit, which has pretty much now taken place. Oh, there we go. So now we're captured. I'm going to time warp down to our periapsis and perform a retrograde burn just to get ourselves into a nice low Eve orbit so we can start thinking about where we want to land. And really, I just wanted to land on the light side of the planet. I didn't really care where. I know I said at the beginning of this video that I wanted to land somewhere near Eve sea level, but it's very hard to predict where you're going to land with this particular graphics mod I've got installed because, as you can see, you can't really see anything on the surface. So I'm just going to decelerate to land us anywhere on the light side of the planet, and then once we get sight of the ground below us, we can steer our way towards the coast. I'm not actually going to land in the sea though, because I want to do a little EVA walk with our kerbals. We can plant a flag, make sure that our ladders actually provide good access to the cockpit even when on a body such as Eve, where you can't use the RCS pack to get back on board a ship. And plus, ocean landings are just not as fun as solid ground landings in my opinion, because when you're on the solid ground, you can run around, you get to see the kerbals and their little faces having fun. Planting flags is always great as well. When you're in the sea, all they can really do is swim around, and swimming in this game is quite slow and tedious, and really it's just not as fun overall. So that's the main reason why I decided to land on a beach or somewhere very close to the shoreline rather than the ocean itself. Not necessarily because this craft can't ascend from the ocean, but now I think about it, I haven't actually tested it taking off from an aquatic scenario. So maybe that's something that you guys could do at home. You could do some experimentation on behalf of Lowne Aerospace's Kraken Drive division. You could download this craft from the description, test it out on places like Kerbin, Eve and Lowne, where there is a liquid ocean, and you can always let me know how successful you were with an aquatic takeoff. Anyway, as I'm sure you're aware, Eve's atmosphere is very, very deadly. It can be quite difficult to not succumb to the effects of re-entry when landing on the planet. That's why I did a very, very long retrograde burn to effectively kill off all of our horizontal velocity before we entered the atmosphere to ensure that we didn't burn up or cause heating-related damage to the ship by minimizing the speed at which we hit the atmosphere. And as you can see, not even a temperature gauge showed up, so it clearly worked quite well. Now it's just a case of pointing downward, looking for a place to land. And as luck would have it, we ended up going right for the shoreline straight away. Didn't need to fly any distance whatsoever, pretty much. I landed exactly where I wanted to, which was great, really. And this is actually quite a nice picturesque location, actually. We've got this little peninsula just here, fairly flat, so friendly for spaceplane landing gear. And, you know, we've got some little islands here and there. We've got a really nice ragged shoreline. This is a pretty nice spot to take a landing and have a little picnic in the process, do some science, plant our flag, take some Instagrams on the surface next to the flag we're going to plant. Really, really good stuff. And as you can see, the ground itself looks absolutely fantastic. This is once again part of GamesLinks' Parallax mod that I still have installed because I love it. It creates that ground tessellation that you can see. You see how the ground isn't completely flat. It's got some undulations here and there. Looks a bit wavy. That's the Parallax mod. Highly recommend it. It's in the description if I remember to put it there. Just Google GamesLinks Parallax mod as well if you want. Can't recommend it enough. It's great. And there is Jebediah making a very graceful descent from the spaceplane cockpit, smacking the glass front of his helmet into the ground. And, you know, Eve's atmosphere, it's pretty toxic, right? Eve is basically the Kerbal Space Program answer to Venus, so we don't really want their helmets breaking. So Jebediah maybe might be worth throwing a little bit more caution to the wind next time you need to get out of this craft on Eve. See, Bob Kerbin, great. He falls and lands on his spine, which is fine. Doesn't need that to breathe. I don't even like my own spine. All it does is hold me back. But haha. Moving swiftly along, we can do some science from Eve's surface. Eve's surface, I feel like you don't actually get that much science from getting a surface sample from Eve back to Kerbin. And I feel like returning a surface sample from Eve back to Kerbin should be one of the most prestigious achievements in the game. But you can get more science from doing that on Eeloo, Moho, or any of Jules' moons. So I don't know if that needs addressing, although then again, if you're capable of doing an Eve landing and return with kerbals, you probably have the full tech tree unlocked anyway, or very close to it, where you don't really need that additional science bonus. Don't know, maybe that could be something that could be looked at. Maybe it doesn't need addressing. What are your thoughts? I don't know, doesn't matter. My tech tree is fully unlocked. I don't know why I'm complaining about it so much. So as you can see, all of our science is collected, our Instagrams, they are taken, our flag is planted. So now we can think about performing our ascent back to low Eve orbit. And I accidentally opened our cargo bay doors for some reason. Now we can do a little backflip and point ourselves on the 90-degree vector on the nav ball. I guess that's just a force of habit, really. I mean, it's not, we don't really need to, because again, it doesn't matter how efficient or inefficient we are, we have a Kraken drive. That being said, we are still fairly low in Eve's atmosphere, where there is a lot of atmospheric drag, so we're not going to go anywhere fast. So I will play this footage back quicker than I've played it back so far, just because we're pointing upward, and that's all we're doing, and it took quite a while. So that's why I'm just playing the footage back fairly quickly now, because I think you can sort of figure out how this goes. Although weirdly, once we got past about the 30-kilometer mark, we suddenly started nosediving. I'm not quite sure why, because in response to this nosedive, I then pointed our craft back up into the sky again, and it didn't happen again. So I'm not quite sure what. At first I thought it might have been when the nav ball switched from surface velocity to orbital velocity, but it didn't. Like, here we go. It's still relative to surface velocity, but our prograde marker has suddenly dropped downward. So bit of a weird happening, not quite sure what caused it, but just be aware that if you're doing this mission using the craft from the description, this might happen. So just keep an eye on your screen. If it happens, it's fairly easy to overcome. And do I spy some stars in the sky? That means that we have cleared the thickest parts of Eve's atmosphere, and now we, of course, have left the atmosphere entirely. Now it's just going to be a case of pointing prograde and continuing with our Kraken drive burn to circularize into a low Eve orbit, and then we can think about getting back to Kerbin. And I say think about getting back to Kerbin in the loosest sense of the word think, because we don't have to do any thinking at all. It doesn't matter how hard it's going to be to get back, because we have the Delta V to do it, because Delta V is irrelevant. We have a Kraken drive. We have infinite range. So what you could do at this point is now go and visit every other planet and moon in the game, including the surface of Jool. I haven't tested this landing on Jool, but I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be able to do a Jool landing and return, because we have infinite range. I should probably just qualify that when I say Jool landing, I mean you can't literally land on Jool. It doesn't have a solid surface, but you can reach 0 meters on the altitude gauge, and there is a way you can get kerbals out of a cockpit to take a surface sample, and I believe it's even possible to plant a flag, although that can get quite finicky, and since we're already using a glitchy craft as it is, might not be worth pushing your luck. But you can certainly run some science experiments and return, including things like a crew report from the lowest parts of Jool's atmosphere, which is incredibly hard to do otherwise. So as you can see, our separation indicators are rapidly closing in on one another. I'm doing a similar thing to what I did to get from Kerbin to Eve, and just spinning around on the nav ball trying to force those nodes together in the most lazy way possible, but it's also the quickest way possible. And since efficiency is not really a thing we need to worry about, it was fine by me. And wow, our transfer back to Kerbin was so quick that by the time I talked about plotting our encounter, we have now arrived back at our home planet. So once again, we're going to perform a big retrograde burn to circularize around Kerbin, and then we're going to land back on the planet in a very similar fashion to Eve, where we're just going to drop down into a low Kerbin orbit, find where we want to land, which in this case is somewhere very specific. It's the Kerbal Space Center. Just kill off all of our horizontal velocity when we're pretty much above our target destination, and just fall down nice and easily. Oh, just doing a little bit of cheeky science whilst we wait to get to our periapsis point. Now, I have already now talked about everything I need to talk about specifically, so I guess I could address one thing that some people might be wondering. That is why I keep calling this thing a Kraken drive, and why that is the popular term for craft such as this. The reason for this is because glitches in this game are typically explained away by the deep space Kraken. You had a ship in Kerbal Space Program that just sort of shook itself to pieces, or suddenly just exploded spontaneously for no reason. Well, that, my friend, is the deep space Kraken causing that damage. So it's kind of become this pet name for any kind of glitch that isn't really explained in Kerbal Space Program. You just say, oh, it's the Kraken. And by harnessing a glitch, such as what we're doing in this craft here, we can say that it's a Kraken drive, because the Kraken has been harnessed, it has been tamed. We are using the Kraken to our advantage for once, and not allowing it to dash all of our hopes and dreams. which has happened to me more times than I care to admit. But those days are gone, at least for this video. I mean, I'm sure it will happen to me at some point in the future, but not right now, which is the important thing. So as you can see, it's pretty rubbish, our descent down to Kerbin. Actually, now I think about it, I didn't really put all that much thought into it. I just waited till I was about just above the Kerbal Space Center and then just pointed retrograde and killed off pretty much all of our horizontal velocity. As you can see, we did end up undershooting our target a little bit, but it really doesn't matter because we can just activate that Kraken Drive once again and zoom towards the Space Center nice and easily. And there it is there. So what did you think of this video? It's definitely something different. A Kraken Drive SSTO is something I've always thought about doing, but never really ended up doing. And I have always wondered about this docking port exploit. Like, it has popped into my mind occasionally. Like, I wonder if you can just exploit the magnets of the docking ports to make Kraken Drives, but I never really put too much thought into it beyond that. But then I stumbled upon Maximillion Bucks's video and then subsequently found the Reddit post that quote-unquote invented this particular Kraken Drive. So here we are today. I thought I'd give it a shot myself, and I really did enjoy Maximillion Bucks's video. We'll put a link to that in the description. He's only got 103 subscribers, and he seems to make pretty good Kerbal content, so you can always go and check him out if you can't wait till next Saturday for your next Kerbal Space Program fix. We have now stopped on the runway, which brings an end to this mission. I really hope you enjoyed it once again. Definitely something different for this channel, but I nonetheless very much enjoyed that departure from the norm. Anyway, I think we're about ready to cut across to an end screen now. So on the left hand side is a link to a video chosen for you by YouTube's recommendation algorithm based on your viewing habits. The video on the right is my most recent upload, whatever that may be. In the description you'll find links to social media, Discord, and my brand new merchandise line as well, so do be sure to check those things out, as well as things like my Patreon and stuff. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching once again. Goodbye.